Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Karen Ashley, Head of Marketing for Refinitiv in the Americas. This year has been like no other, full of unprecedented events that have shaken the world order. The corona pandemic, probably the most unanticipated event of our lifetimes, led to the biggest market and data moves in history. And as the year draws to a close, yet another event has the potential to rattle markets, the 2020 presidential elections, the results of which will have a major effect on domestic and global markets, the economy, foreign policy, and other areas of importance to investors. It may be the most important election of modern times, and it's certainly one of the most decisive. To help investors better understand what's at stake, Refinitiv is offering data-driven insights, webinars, chats, and live events that will keep you updated and informed. Next week, today's webinar is the first of 3 that we will offer. Next week, we'll convene a group of experts to discuss antitrust and technology. We want to keep today's webinar led by Richard Mabley, Head of News Performance and former energy editor at Reuters. We want to keep this interactive. Put your questions in the Q&A box, lobby them to us throughout, and we'll try to take them. And, let us know what you're thinking. Let us know what your viewpoints are. And I will come back at the end. I'll share more information with you about other events that we will be having and how you can stay connected to the news and information that we have available for you. So, Richard, over to you.
Thanks very much, Karen. Yeah, we have a probably history-making election coming up, particularly for energy policy. Energy is right in the limelight. We have some great speakers for you today. Bob McNally, who's the president of Rapidan in Washington. John Kemp in London, who is a very well-known columnist for Reuters. And from behind the scenes, one of Reuters' longest-standing energy editors, Rich Valdmanis, who looks after energy and environmental policy for Reuters in the US. We're going to start, though, with a poll. We want to ask you, and we're going to ask you this again at the end, do you think the election of Donald Trump or Joe Biden will make a meaningful difference for the trajectory of oil prices in 2021? You've just got to answer yes or no. And if you think yes is the answer to that question, we want to know whether you think Biden, a Biden administration would mean higher or lower prices than another Trump presidency. So 2 questions for you. We're going to that poll will come up. We will continue with the webinar as you're answering that, and we're going to start off by looking at what a second Trump presidency will mean. We're also going to look at what Biden would mean for foreign energy policy for the US and domestic energy policy. So starting off, Bob, if we can start with you. If Donald Trump is re-elected, do you expect him to change tack on the big story that makes a big difference, it seems, for the past several presidencies on Iran? And if so, what sort of impact is a second Trump presidency going to have on Iranian exports?
Thank you, Richard. And it's great to be with you and Karen and others on this panel. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Yeah, I think when we think about a Trump administration, second term, to paraphrase the campaign slogan, sort of make America great again, it's sort of going to be more of the same, but more. And when we get into the domestic side of the discussion, the 6-3 potentially conservative Supreme Court, we can talk about that. But you raised Iran, and I think that is an area where near term, the differences between Biden and Trump are most stark and consequential. for the price of oil next year and for fundamentals. Donald Trump, we expect, and this may be somewhat surprising, in some ways, I think he and Biden will both do a deal with Iran. Donald Trump wants to do a nuclear deal with Iran. All of his career, he has not been opposed to the Iranian regime. He only became fiercely opposed into the nuclear deal in the 2016 campaign. That was quite controversial and opposed by many Democrats, that nuclear deal. So he will push for a tough deal, but in our view, our read is Donald Trump wants to check that box in his second term. However, he will not rush into it next year. Indeed, we expect he will tighten the screws further, economically, with sanctions, politically, and even militarily. So if anything, we see a tightening screws next year. The Iranian regime is not going to cave in to Donald Trump early next year if he is reelected. So we don't think there's likely to be a deal until later in Donald Trump's term, at which point we would have to start to calculate the impact of a return of some 1.8 million barrels a day or so of Iranian exports. There was a recent burst in exports, but we don't think that's sustainable. Now, with Joe Biden, there's the contrast. Joe Biden has not written many op-eds. He hasn't. But his most recent one, and a rare one, was basically saying, look, I'm going to make a beeline for the JCPOA if I'm elected. He's made it very clear that is a top foreign policy priority. And as part of that, he will have to allow, Iran will insist on allowing its exports to return. So we, and I suspect if Biden wins other barrel counters, we'll start to pencil in a return of Iran's barrels, we think, the second half of next year. First half is too fast. It'll take time for him to get in place. So we think then you have to step back and say, well, if the oil market is still soggy, if OPEC Plus is facing challenges, pressure to perhaps cease the tapering and if not extend cuts or deepen them, the return of 1.8 million barrels a day in the second half of next year will be most unwelcome for many parties. And so I think there with Iran next year, it's perhaps the most consequential impact, again, of the election outcome.
Okay, thanks, Bob. So, John, do you want to comment on that? Do you think it's inevitable that, and Bob, follow up if you like, do you think it's inevitable that if Biden is elected, Iran comes back to the oil market in sometime in the second half of last year? Or can you put a percentage chance against that?
I think it's clearly more likely that Iranian barrels will come back to the market under a Biden administration than under a second Trump administration, in the nearer term. The one thing I would probably stress, and I think this is probably going to be a recurring theme for me throughout this conference call, is the continuities in American policy, as well as the discontinuities. And one of the things that worries me a little bit is that, clearly President Biden and many of his advisors would want to go back to something like the sort of Obama-era JCPOA. The issue is going to be, I think, is it going to be simply re-entering the JCPOA so, the Iranians accept exactly the same restrictions on their nuclear activities as before, and in return, they're allowed to freely export oil? Or will there be pressure on a Biden administration to try to deal with some of those other non-nuclear issues that the United States has, the issues of Iranian support for armed groups throughout the Middle East, for example, Iranian's ballistic missile program? And I think there would be a lot of pressure on a Biden administration to show that it was making some progress on those other areas. So the question is, do you do a deal with Iran? Do you simply resurrect the Obama-era deal, and you recognize that will generate a lot of criticism within the region from some U.S. allies, and it will also generate a lot of criticism at home, where it will be seen as sort of rewarding Iranian intransigence? Or do you try to say, well, actually, renewing the JCPOA is conditional on progress on some of these other issues, and then we get back to the question about whether or not there is a deal to be done with the Iranians and how quickly? I do think, on balance, that a Biden administration will get back into the JCPOA. But I think it may take a little bit longer than some people are assuming, just because I think there are some other sort of collateral issues to be worked through in the meantime.
Okay, thank you. And Rich, do you have a view on? I think it comes as a surprise to me. I've not been following the story as close as I used to be when I was at Reuters on Trump's relationship with Iran. Do you think is that something you're hearing from your reporters, that that's a possibility that Trump might consider a deal at some point in the second term?
Well, we haven't really been hearing that. I mean, one thing we have been hearing is that there's not a huge amount of diplomacy to go along with the sanctions, which is a strong signal that there's no significant effort at the moment to do anything beyond the sanctions. The sanctions are here to stay until the regime sort of weakens and crumbles. That's kind of the feeling that some people are getting in the diplomatic space. The other thing I would add is that the sanctions on Iran dovetail neatly with the Trump administration's sort of energy dominance policy, which is essentially to maximize domestic energy production while constraining the production of rivals.
Yeah. Okay. No, well, we've dived straight into, I guess, what is the biggest issue, I think, between these two options for president. And related to that, of course, is what the relationship that Joe Biden and his administration might have with the Saudis and therefore the rest of OPEC. Do you think that's likely to change? Do you think that, Bob, if we can go back to you, that there'll be a different relationship between the US and the Gulf, in particular the Saudis? Most
certainly, and partly because of the Iran return, which John mentioned. Indeed, Saudi Arabia and Israel and the UAE and others will say, look, you just can't run back to even a slightly tweaked JCPOA and let Iran return with the exports and then, abandon the war in Yemen, the terrorism support, the missiles, et cetera, Lebanon. But we think indeed that is sort of what Biden will do. He's talking about it in a kind of almost like a two-phased approach. He's not ignoring the, let's call it, side issues, and he will reassure the Saudis and the Israelis and others that he will get to those other issues. But I think he understands, to start the discussion, the Iranians will insist on a return to some form of a JCPOA, probably not the just off the shelf from the old one from Obama, some tweaks to it. But that'll be phase one, and phase two will be all the other issues that can be swept in. And so for that reason, partly, there's going to be a sort of a froid d'oeil, as the French might say, between Riyadh and Washington. But if you think about it from the left of the Democratic Party, and I hope we'll talk today about how it has shifted. Biden is very much a centrist. All his career, he remains a centrist, but the center has moved far to the left by American standards in the last 4 years. And one of those is on Saudi Arabia. In fact, if you ask, say, what are the most important energy-related foreign policy consequences of a Biden victory, I think it would be after a return to the Paris Agreement and re-engagement on climate change policy. It would be a utter and complete reversal in relationships with Riyadh. If you look at the Senator Bernie Sanders wing of the party, they have singled out Saudi Arabia as the main issue, really, after climate, as where they want to take a different path. It has to do with Khashoggi. It has to do with Saudi Arabia being a major producer of a commodity now that is accused of sort of burning and killing the planet. It has to do with the war in Yemen and so forth. And so, yes, now Biden is old school, and I think he, in his heart, doesn't have this animus towards Saudi Arabia. But he will be under enormous pressure to get tougher with Saudi Arabia. And the question then becomes, will he expend political capital to veto legislation coming out of the Congress aimed at Saudi Arabia? It could be on JASTA kind of related issues, terrorism issues, funding for the war in Yemen, arms sales, and even if oil prices go up again, the notorious OPEC legislation. So yes, I think we're in for a rocky time between Riyadh and Washington. if Joe Biden is elected, and especially if the Democrats take the Senate.
Yes, indeed. Having those three parts of government would make that much more straightforward. John, do you agree with that? That Saudi is probably the biggest change after climate change and a return to the Paris Agreement if Biden's elected?
Yeah, I think I do. I mean, I think both Saudi Arabia and the UAE have become extremely close, perhaps too close to the Trump administration. There is definitely, I think, a perception that the Saudi leadership has backed Donald Trump personally, not just as the president of the United States, but as a personal ally. And I think that raises some delicate questions in the event that Trump loses. I think there will be a perception that, perhaps that the Saudis have tilted a little bit too far towards one particular political party, and if the other one comes to power, that will introduce a bit of friction into that relationship. Is one of the reasons I think that the UAE has been busy trying to sort of distance itself a little bit from some of Saudi Arabia's more controversial policies, for example, in Yemen recently. I think it's one of the reasons that the UAE, very much it looks at the moment like the UAE is hedging its bets on the US presidential election, trying to depersonalize the relationship with the Trump administration, trying to ensure that if there is a change of administration, that the underlying relationship between the two countries remains quite strong. Saudi Arabia, I think, is in a much, much more delicate position. The Saudi leadership went much further to embrace and to support Donald Trump. And vice versa. And I think in the event that Donald Trump loses and is replaced by Joe Biden, I think that will be a major change in that relationship. It will, on issues like Iran, for example. I think the Saudis will be quite unhappy if the JCPOA comes back into effect and Iran is allowed to start exporting substantial volumes of oil. I think the Saudis may feel that some of their priorities are being downplayed. So I think it does actually. I think it will be quite it will be, if there is a change of administration, it will be quite difficult for the kingdom. And there is a whole list of issues. I mean, everything from Iran through to Yemen, through to Khashoggi, but also, questions. I mean, the US intelligence community has been very close to certain members of the Saudi royal family and the Saudi elite who are currently under house arrest. The CIA was very close to some of the bin Nayef branch of the family. So there's a whole list of issues that will be quite tense. And I think a Biden administration might feel that it's certainly not beholden to Saudi Arabia, and it may feel that Saudi Arabia has been supporting its opponents. So I think there could be quite a lot of distance.
Yeah. Okay. And sort of related to this, because obviously Trump supported the shale industry when the price of oil was going negative briefly earlier this year. Is on the other side of the coin, is that likely to end? Bob, do you think Biden is likely to do the same if we see another massive? Well, if we see Iranian barrels coming back and demand is obviously suffering still big time, do you think Joe Biden will support the shale industry as Trump has done?
Not nearly as much as Trump has done. And you raised a good point. One of the most remarkable metamorphoses in the Trump administration has been his sort of shift from being an arch foe of OPEC. And if you look at his readings and writings over the years, second only to China, sometimes more so than China, Donald Trump has excoriated OPEC for being price-raising manipulators. He's been honest about that. Not only has he changed his view and realized it's OPEC plus now with Russia and 11 other countries, but Russia really a key player, he understands after the second quarter that a swing producer, and this now with OPEC plus the only game in town, is absolutely critical for any hope of price stability. And with energy dominance threatened by wellhead prices below $40, Donald Trump learned in the second quarter he needs OPEC Plus, and he became a master of the deal. And so, were we to get in another circumstance, and it could be as soon as the November 30th, December 1st meeting, if the election outcome is unclear, and OPEC Plus has to consider either ending the tapering, postponing the tapering, cutting more. Things look soggy next year. Donald Trump, we can be sure, will be working the phones proactively with MBS, Saudi Deputy Crown Prince, and President Putin, as he did in April. Joe Biden won't do that. He will not leap to shale's defense. Now, that being said, to be fair and honest, now I come from the right of the political spectrum. I work for George W. Bush, but we call balls and strikes here at Rapid End Energy Group. And to be fair, here's the difference between, let's say, I think Bernie Sanders and a Joe Biden. I think Joe Biden, if we see a return of the second quarter and Saudi Arabia and Russia begin squabbling again and oil just collapses into the teens or single digits, I think Biden and some of the folks around him will understand what a risk that poses, not only to the shale industry, which he will be less concerned about than Donald Trump, of course, but also just general economic growth, financial stability, and geopolitical stability. And I would imagine probably a delayed, more low-key approach, as we saw in the Obama administrations and Clinton, that they understood and their advisors understood that what OPEC does sometimes is actually critical, not only, again, for energy stability, but macroeconomic stability. So I wouldn't imagine there'll probably be some late cajoling on the down low, but nothing like the proactive head banging that you saw in April from Donald Trump.
Right. Thanks, Bob. Rich, so what's your point of view? What is the reporting showing, I should ask, because obviously Reuters journalists don't really have points of view. How far do you think the Biden administration is going to go in actually restricting, rather than supporting, but perhaps restricting domestic U.S. oil and gas production? And do you think they'll push through on any form of federal drilling bans on production?
Yeah, well, I mean, Biden's been very, very clear about this. His promise is that he's going to ban all future permits for drilling on federal lands and waters, and that's actually it's a purely domestic policy. It affects the U.S. production, but in a very big way that could have international consequences. That's 3 million barrels per day that's coming out of federal lands and waters at the moment, roughly, which is about a quarter of supply at the peak. It's also about an eighth of U.S. gas supply, and presumably, if he did this, we would see those numbers start declining, I guess gradually towards zero, depending on the length of time that existing permits have left. So that's a pretty big deal. It's also a fairly big deal for federal revenues as well, because something like $12 billion were collected by the government on revenues on federal lands in 2019, and that's divided up between the Treasury and states like New Mexico. New Mexico itself got something like $2 billion from its share of the Permian Basin, and that's a really important amount of money for them to rebuild their education system. And it's a Democratic-run state, and there's a bit of a wrinkle here because New Mexico's governor last spring told us that if Biden's elected, she's going to seek a waiver for her state, and she's on his advisory committee. So the question is, will there be a waiver program for states like New Mexico, Colorado, and others who depend heavily on revenue from federal lands? And if so, is that going to take the teeth out of this policy? And, we're chasing the Biden camp for comment on this, but nothing yet.
Okay, fabulous. Thanks. So let's just switch now, because Bob, you mentioned this earlier. If we can go back to you on the Supreme Court, if we go to a 6-3 conservative versus liberal Supreme Court, what does that mean for energy policy, deregulation? Does it change environmental legal principles like those we've seen in the past, Chevron deference, or even Massachusetts versus EPA? What is the impact of 6-3 as opposed to where we are now?
Yeah, I'll mention one area where it may not change things too much, and then two that you touched on that would be changed, I think, sharply and portentously. The first is, as we've seen, the Trump administration has had trouble winning in court on pipeline permitting issues. DAPL, Dakota Access Pipeline, being a great recent example. And the reason is because the administration just won't sort of follow procedure. It's not on the merits or the environmental issues involved. It's just he doesn't do the homework and sort of cross the T's and dot the I's. And the president even admitted that, I think, once publicly. It's just we have trouble getting our homework in order and sort of showing the courts that we've sort of checked the boxes you needed to check. And Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice, is a stickler for following procedure. So even with a 6-3 court, I'm not so sure they're going to ignore gross kind of disregard for procedure. And even so, even if it did, it takes a while for those cases to move up the local and state court system. So pipeline operators really better hope the EPA does a better job sort of, and the Justice Department of supporting their cases by kind of showing the courts that they went through the procedures. That's point number one. But the two areas where we could expect huge change is one on Chevron deference that you mentioned. That we think with Ann Corbett in, we think could be overturned. This is a judicial precept which says, basically, since the 80s, if an administration is making a decision on a regulation, it deserves deference. It deserves the benefit of the doubt as long as it's a reasonable decision. The courts are going to sort of side with EPA or BLM or whoever. So Chevron deference is a crucial factor in driving environmental legislation. The big one, though, the taproot or the bedrock of environmental policymaking is the Clean Air Act that affects energy. And especially since 2007, when the Supreme Court said you must consider greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. That, I think, is the whole ball of wax in some ways. And we think with 6-3, you're going to have a court that's going to basically say, we really don't like it when government makes stuff up under the law, or courts have allowed sort of a policy to be imposed that really involves a stretching of the original intent and the original text of statute. So do we expect Massachusetts versus EPA to be utterly disregarded? Probably not. There will be less regard for precedent on a court. This is 6-3. But we don't think they go so far as to repealing or setting aside Mass versus EPA. That would be the game changer. However, we wouldn't rule that out. We just don't think it's likely. However, sure, we think they will tailor it and narrow it. So getting back to California, for example, its plan to ban ICE cars by 2035 really depends, like so much, on its authority under the Clean Air Act to administer its own programs that 14 states tend to follow. And so about a third of our car fleet. So if the court comes in, they could severely narrow, circumscribe, reduce the ability of states to go forward, the ability for regulators to regulate under the Clean Air Act. And that goes, by the way, for Biden or Trump. And again, if you imagine a Biden administration, especially with a Democratic Senate, which is likely if he wins, facing a 6-3 court like this, and assuming there's no packing of judges, et cetera, this is one more reason why the Democrats are likely to pass meaningful legislation, if necessary, by getting rid of what we call the filibuster, this rule that requires 60 of 100 votes. So the court, whoever wins, is going to be a major factor in driving regulatory changes in the next term. Okay,
thanks. Rich, on the other side of the coin, do you think there's a chance that under Biden, the Clean Power Plan, as opposed to the old Clean Air Act, might be resurrected? Is there any? Do you hear talk of that?
Yeah, I mean, Biden has promised as part of his climate plan to bring the U.S. power sector to net zero emissions by 2035, which is far more ambitious than the Obama Clean Power Plan. He hasn't defined how this would happen. I mean, it would involve a great deal of investment in clean energy, technology to help grids that are solar and wind dominated to be resilient and survive certain weather conditions. So the question is, what is the mechanism for this? And if you read Biden's plan, he points to the fact that there's going to be a mechanism for reducing carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. We have to figure out what that is. He doesn't mention carbon pricing or cap and trade or anything like that. We don't know what the regulation is going to be like, but whatever it is, it's not going to be CPP. It's going to be much stronger, much bigger.
Okay, interesting. And John, just to sort of maybe to umbrella this, I think we're assuming that a Biden administration returns to the Paris Climate Accord. What do you see? And let's assume that under Trump that doesn't happen. As Bob said earlier, it's more of the same. What do you see as the big shift under Biden, where the U.S. is concerned on climate diplomacy and the shift to renewables as a result of that?
I mean, again, I think it's a little bit like the issue with Iran. I mean, at one level, I think the Biden administration's temptation will be simply to re-enter the Paris Climate Agreement as it was in 2016. The issue, I think, will be whether there will be pressure to say, look, if we're going to go back into the Paris Climate Agreement, we have some concerns about the level of ambition for other member countries. In particular, I'm thinking about China and India and some of the other emerging markets. So again, the question in my mind is there a temptation to say we want to go back, but we want some additional commitments from other members of the agreement, before we re-enter? And I think particularly because there has been quite a big shift. There's both a shift in terms of the balance of economic power between China and the United States over the course of the last 4 years. But there's also a real change in terms of atmospherics. I mean, back at the tail end of the Obama administration, there was still sort of quite a lot of enthusiasm for engaging China, particularly on climate issues. Now China is seen much more as a strategic competitor or even a strategic adversary. And that sort of Washington consensus isn't going to go away just because you have a Biden administration. And I think there might be some degree of pressure on a President Biden and his officials to say, OK, if we're going to go back into the Paris Agreement, we're looking for some perhaps tougher commitments on the part of China. So I do think, again, it's a little bit like the Iran one. It's not, you can't just undo the last 4 years and kind of pick up where the Obama administration left off. I'd just like to make one issue that, picking up on what Bob said earlier about the Supreme Court. I do think that we're probably underestimating the probability of Supreme Court reconstruction. I do think that let's assume that there is a 6-3 court by November. I think there are 3 potential scenarios. Clearly, the first potential scenario is that Donald Trump gets re-elected. And in that case, we have a significant sort of rightward shift in the court. The second scenario is sort of a President Biden is re-elected, but he doesn't have a majority in the Senate. And again, I think that you see a rightward shift in the court. But the third scenario, in President Biden is elected and he has a majority in the Senate, I think opens up quite a strong possibility, actually, of court reconstruction. If a Biden administration found that all of its signature initiatives, all the things that it wants to do in terms of climate regulation, in terms of labor relations reform, etc., if all of these start getting bottled up by a conservative Supreme Court that takes a very skeptical view of government action, I think the pressure on a Biden administration to change the composition of the court would be enormous. And you have a relatively narrow 2-year time window to do it, assuming that you have President Biden and a Democrat Party controlled House of Representatives and Senate. So I think we really need to, when we talk about the future of the Supreme Court, we can't assume that it remains at 9 members. I think that the incentive to increase the size of the court would actually be quite strong if a Democratic administration felt that its signature issues were being blocked.
Right. So you go to 11.
I think you could do two things.
Well,
I mean, you could go to 11. You could say, look, we're not changing the balance of the court. We're simply adding some additional liberal voices. Or if you wanted to be really ballsy, you go to 15 and you say, look, you know, Donald Trump has shredded a whole bunch of political norms over the last 4 years. Now it's our turn. Elections have consequences. You know, we can pass ordinary legislation with a straightforward majority that allows us to increase the number of seats. So I do think we need to that needs to be there. We can't assume that the court remains at 6-3, you know, for an indefinite period.
Bob, do you have a view on that? We don't spend too much more time on the Supreme Court, but clearly, and it's relevant to many other, virtually every policy in the US.
Yeah, you can't rule it out. I would agree with John. The probability is not zero that a Biden and a Democratic Senate would pack the court with additional members. And we can say reconstruct, but it's really add members so as to overturn the 6-3 conservative majority. So let's be very clear. That would be a Fort Sumter moment in American politics. Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to do it in the 1930s, and the backlash was so fierce, he backed down. That idea, though, is out there. And Joe Biden will not say if he supports it or not. Another one is to add states to the Union, which can be done, like the Supreme Court, fairly easily with a clear just Senate majority. So there's talk of adding District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. So for all the volatility and the polarization and animosity you've seen and anger in the country so far, were Biden to take that fateful step, believe me, it would increase 10 times. The Republicans would start immediately saying, well, we're going to add back the number of justices that Biden added, and we'll add more states, too, if we have to. So you'll get then a authentic blood sport in American politics that you haven't seen really since the Civil War, I think. And that's one reason why I think that like the moderates in the Senate, some Democrats like Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, he's already said, no way am I going that far. So I think with Biden, you're going to see an attempt to tone things down. And I think his more likely option, were he to be stymied by a 6-3 court, as I said, is to get rid of the filibuster, which will be dramatic enough, and pass legislation that sort of hardwires the regulatory changes they want to make, so to get around the Supreme Court that way. You can't rule it out, but buckle up if he packs the Supreme Court.
Right. Okay. And just back to the previous question we were on Paris. Where do you see that affecting the domestic U.S. oil industry most? Even if it takes a period of time, do you think climate diplomacy in itself has an impact on the U.S. oil and gas industry's balance with renewables? Or is that simply a commercial business decision-making process?
No, absolutely no question. First of all, I think in terms of the sequence, look, there are certain things a Joe Biden has to do on day one. He has to take his pen and he has to at least symbolically utterly reverse some key Trump policies to placate his base and to get political will to get the harder work done later in the year. One is he has to say we're going back into Paris. Now, he may say, as John's absolutely right, he may say we're going back in, but we want to look at what China's doing. We see some backsliding there and this and that. But I think the message will be, and it could be symbolic, is we're back in Paris. And there will be joy, rapturous joy all throughout Europe on this. And but I think the Paris Agreement per se doesn't really matter too much for U.S. production. Where it matters a lot more, though, just by re-engaging, is that Europe, which is getting ready, I think, over the coming years to start taxing imports from jurisdictions where there's not sufficient green protections, is likely to sort of work with the Biden administration to harmonize that. So to avoid, if you will, a green trade war, where Europe is getting ready again for border adjustment taxes on an environmental basis, they could start dinging, tariffing U.S. LNG for the flaring of LNG relative to other sources of gas, and et cetera. And I think a Biden administration, in some ways, ironically, could actually smooth that a little bit and get Europe to work with the United States, try to have a harmonized approach. Costs will go up, but I think you'll have a less contentious U.S.-EU, let's say, trade battle, tariff battle over energy trade, which I think will happen under Trump. If you had a Biden who was, with goodwill, re-engaging in the Paris Agreement, albeit, as John said again, there's going to be a lot of horse trading and so forth over time, but it's going to be like with the United States at the table. By far, the biggest implications for oil and gas, a Biden administration have to do with domestic policy and regulations, possible legislation, water regulation, leasing bans, as we discussed. Those are the types of things that are really going to impact, I think, the balance sheets of the oil and gas companies.
Gotcha. Okay. So we've done climate change. We've done the Supreme Court. When we were going through the countries that really matter for U.S. energy policy abroad, I guess the big one that we've not talked about is Russia. And clearly, Russia's been in the headlines a lot since Trump came to power. How does that relationship change? What does it mean for the global oil markets if Joe Biden becomes president? John, do we want to start this one?
No, I think it probably reverts to a much more traditional, relationship with the Russians. I mean, there is a lot of skepticism across both parties in Washington and across institutional Washington about the behavior of the Russian government and Vladimir Putin. And I think that has been restrained over the last 4 years by President Trump. But I think if you have a change of president, then I think the United States will revert to a more skeptical, almost more openly hostile position towards Moscow. So I think that's one area where you will see, again, basically what you've had is a couple of highly personalized relationships between the White House and Saudi Arabia, the White House and Moscow. And I think those relationships will be depersonalized. And I think they will revert to something much more like a sort of Washington institutional consensus. So I think it will remake the relationship. There is a longer-term question, which I think is true for both types of administration, which is if China is identified as your primary long-term strategic competitor or strategic adversary, there is going to be pressure to try to repair relationships with Russia in the long term, to try to further isolate the Chinese in the same way that the United States tried to, during the USSR Cold War, tried to split China away from the Soviet Union, to try to sort of increase the isolation of the USSR. Long term, if China is identified as the new primary strategic threat, there is a long-term, I think, interest in trying to improve relationships with the Russians and peel them a little bit for the Chinese.
Okay.
But that is, I think, a long-term trend.
Yep. And Rich, is any talk in the Biden team about getting tough on Russia, particularly if they feel that there's been interference in this election, let alone the last one? Is there any prospect under Biden, or indeed under a second Trump administration, of tougher sanctions or an easing of sanctions on Russia?
Well, unclear. It's tough to read the tea leaves there. There hasn't been a whole lot of discussion on that from the Biden side. I would just point out, though, that Biden and Trump do appear to be aligned on the issue of attempting to contain Russia's energy influence in Europe, for example. Trump's been very tough on the Russia Nord Stream 2 project into Germany, and Biden that's actually a similar stance to the Obama-Biden administration. So I would suspect that they would hold a similar view on those kinds of things. And as far as sanctions on Venezuela and Russia, taking oil and so on from there, I think you would probably see a similar approach, in the short term, as long as those sanctions existed. But more broadly, I'd agree with my fellow speakers.
Okay. Well, so Bob, where are you on Russia? Do we have a change here under either administration?
Yeah, no, generally I agree. Putin, Trump had a sort of soft spot for Vladimir Putin, but has been tough, as Richard said, on Nord Stream 2. I think a Biden would have a colder shoulder. I will say, though, I actually think the odds of Nord Stream 2 getting completed would go up under Biden. And here's why. Again, I think a Biden victory will unleash, peals of joy throughout Western Europe, and nobody will be happier than Angela Merkel. And I think her priority right now is to spring Nord Stream 2, that last little segment, from Washington. And again, the administration only recently really got tough on it in terms of administration sanctions. The animosity towards the Nord Stream 2 really comes from Congress, less so the Trump administration, but they got tough this summer. So if Biden comes in, notwithstanding he will be tough on Putin, I can see energy sanctions, more of them on Putin, on Russia. He will confront Russia. However, I can see him sort of working with Angela Merkel to find a way to maybe allow Germany and Russia to complete that last little segment. Maybe there has to be some give and take on Ukraine or Donbass or other things. But I think a Biden administration would be more likely to see the end of Nord Stream 2 as sort of a gesture to Germany, who will make it a top priority, in my view, than
Sure.
Trump. He has no love lost for Angela Merkel. And also, finally, the Republicans see Nord Stream 2 from a competitive standpoint. We want to sell our LNG there. Biden and the Democrats don't have that. They don't have that competitive motivation to oppose Nord Stream 2, the Republicans do.
Right. So there's a large country in the world we haven't touched on yet, which was, probably the major story before coronavirus came around. And that's China and trade. Where do you see that going now? Where, obviously, in particular, where oil and gas are concerned, and does that change again under both Trump version 2 or Biden? Bob, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, so. If it's Trump, it's a Cold War. I think only the COVID catastrophe has forced Trump into unleashing what he planned to unleash in a second term. As one of my colleagues says, Gefei Li, to kick China back to the 1980s. So that is, I think Trump believes one of the reasons he's put on earth and to be president is to do that. And he will resume that, focusing on IT and other forms of economic and even military containment and pressure. He really wants to get on that. He would have parked it and suspended it for the election because it was hurting the stock market, but COVID came along, and alas, it had to go further. Now, China is buying a lot of oil and LNG from the United States, along with NGLs and food. Now, they need the food. To some degree, a little bit, they need the NGLs. They don't really need, though, the LNG and the crude oil. It's a buyer's market. So we think if Biden gets elected, I would think that the voracious Chinese buying of crude oil, although not at the levels they were supposed to, that will taper off a little bit. They're only buying that crude, I think, to placate Trump, to keep some sort of a stability in the relationship here up and through the election, while praying that Biden wins. So in a second term, though, I think all gloves come off. I think China may initially keep buying our energy to keep Trump happy, but I think it really goes into much more of a deeper Cold War, and they will probably cease the heavy buys of crude oil. They'll still buy the food which they need. If Biden comes in, similarly, I think the heavy buying of crude oil we've seen this summer will probably taper off because Biden really doesn't care about that. Biden will probably reduce some tariffs. He'll shift the focus onto Uyghurs, human rights, intellectual property theft. But the big thing for Biden, and this is clear in all of his comments and his energy plan as well, if you look at his plan to, say, for example, convert, require all new buses be zero emission in 2030, the campaign says, we'll do it to the best we can, to the maximum extent possible without China. We'll do it at home. There's this tension, as John mentioned, between build it in America, make America first, which is now bipartisan and is a continuity in politics, and a desire to hook up with China to accelerate electrification of the transportation fleet. And they'll have to struggle with that, and that'll be a tough one, even for the environmentalists in Congress, because they're really at odds there on that. But we think it's a cold détente. As John mentioned, there's no going back to Chimerica. There's going to be more of a domestic focus and a hostile focus towards China in all areas, including electrification and progress on climate change.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks. John, is that where you are on China, or do you have a different point of view?
No, I think I'd agree with that entirely. I mean, I think you've got, I think that what Bob sketched out is two scenarios. Under a second Trump administration, I think you have unrestrained, unrestricted competition between the United States and China. And I think that pushes you towards a new Cold War with zero cooperation in all areas, from technology through to trade, through to climate change. The challenge for a Biden administration is to maintain a fairly sort of tough line on security issues, but try to find some way of re-engaging China on climate and some other issues that other priority areas. I think it will be exceptionally tough, if I'm honest. I think it will be very, very difficult to do that. There is a degree of suspicion, mutual suspicion and hostility between the United States and China that there just wasn't in 2016. But otherwise, I would agree absolutely with what Bob said.
Okay, thank you. I think we've reached the point where we really need to sum up for our patient audience. Bob, do you want to start just by sort of running through what you think the big changes will be under a Biden presidency? We've run through a whole bunch of issues. Perhaps we could just sort of order them, and you could just run through to summarize where you think the big changes will be.
Yeah. So I would say and we've touched on some of them, for the oil and gas industry and for energy markets. Number one is that sort of combo of a rapprochement with Iran and a froideur with Saudi Arabia. That impacts the balances, and it impacts OPEC plus policymaking. I think two of the most important questions for this decade is electrification, the pace of electrification, real? That's in the basic, the sort of consensus forecast. Are we really going to see approach to a plateau and then ultimate decline in demand this decade? And number two, will we have a swing producer, effective swing producer? And the election, I think, with regard to Iran and Saudi Arabia and the administration, that second one comes right into play. If we don't have, if the United States is not banging heads in OPEC plus, and balances get overwhelmed by Iran's return, we could have a return to collapsing oil prices next year. So I think that's sort of issue number one. Issue number two is then whether, setting aside the Green New Deal's sort of call for wartime mobilization, the AOC sort of Bernie Sanders' vision of climate change and climate change policy. But even under Biden, there will be I call it a Tet offensive, as short of outright bans and so forth, but just short of that, a spectacular, multifaceted assault on the industry aimed at raising capital, slowing development from sectors that are old and familiar, like sort of methane regulations and fuel economy standards and permitting bans, which have been announced, and then areas we haven't even talked about that have only been sort of touched on lightly or not at all in the campaign. Financial markets. The administration has enormous financial powers. If you weaponize New York and SEC, and you start requiring banks to disclose climate risks and stress tests and maybe divest and so forth, huge powers there. Also, water regulation. I'll leave you with this. If there's one game changer that has gotten much less attention than it deserves, it is, I think, the probability that what is called the Halliburton loophole, or the exemption that hydraulic fracturing enjoys under the Safe Drinking Water Act, will be changed by a Biden administration with a Democratic Senate. Kamala Harris, Senator Harris, the vice president's candidate, openly called for that. And if you look at the regulatory requirements, that if you had, every time you did a frack job, you had to have underground injection control program, or the EPA was helping you design your frac fluid, and those incremental costs go up by over 50% per well. So people talk about a ban. They talk about banning exports. Biden could do that, stroke of the pen. We don't think he will. I think the real game changer no one's talked about, or few have, is drinking water regulation on the oil and gas sector.
Well, perfect segue. Rich, is that something that you're hearing, and if not, or even if you have, do you want to summarize on domestic U.S. policy under Biden?
Yeah, I mean, the main things are, environmental regulation, emissions, and drilling policy. I mean, it's going to be, an all-round rewrite of energy policy that's going to have a huge impact on drillers, on utilities, on auto manufacturers, if Biden wins, and if not, then continuation of the same with a lot of legal wrangling around it. But it's I think this is a pivot point for the energy transition in the States and abroad.
Okay, good. And it sounds as if Bob has commissioned a story for you on water regulation and a change on fracking rules. So I'll look forward to reading that one on Reuters soon. And John,
all right, look forward next week.
Okay, John, your summary for the major issues under a Biden presidency.
I think if we look at Trump versus Biden on a 20-year perspective, there's clearly an enormous difference between the two. Where Donald Trump and Joe Biden would like the energy system to go over the next 20 years is very, very different. A Trump administration will see a future energy system still dominated by fossil fuels, climate change is a hoax, etc. A Biden administration wants to drive a really quite rapid shift towards a renewables-based system with zero carbon emissions. So on a 20-year time horizon, they're headed in completely different directions. In the short term, I think the differences between them are significant, but there are, I think particularly for a Biden administration, if you start trying to force the pace of an energy transition, you need to make sure that you're getting the sequencing right. What I think that you do not want is you do not want domestic oil and gas production to collapse before you've started to replace it with a whole bunch of renewables. You don't want to see either a collapse in domestic production and suddenly the United States becoming more dependent on oil imports, nor do you want to start to see a deterioration in the reliability of your electric grid as we've seen in California. So one of the challenges, I think, for a Biden administration will be to show that the transition can be made to work, can be pro-growth, can be pro-employment, and can ensure that energy remains affordable and secure. And that perhaps is the thing that will limit the speed at which the Biden administration can push through change.
Marvelous. Nice summary, everybody. We're going to go back to the audience just briefly with the poll. Sufyan, if you can call up these two questions again. I confess I didn't see the results. I don't know whether anyone else has been able to spot that. But we will try to poll on whether you think a Biden administration or Trump version 2 will make a difference to oil prices, and if so, whether under Biden they would be higher or lower. So, Sufyan, is that all ready to go? If not,
yes,
it is. Thanks, Karen. I can't actually see that on my screen, so. So where do we see the results? Does it come under a... Oh, there we go. Okay. Now I see it. Poll. Oh, okay. Question 2 popping up. Oh, well, there you go. Yeah, so we had the result there briefly. So we now have 100% of people who think it will make a difference. And everyone thinks the price will be higher. So thanks, everybody. Thanks all the speakers. That means that we have a consensus that there will be higher oil prices under a Biden administration than a new Trump administration. I'm going to leave you with Karen Ashley, who's going to run through a few things we've got planned. Thanks, everybody, for joining this. It's a great discussion. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, John. Thanks, Rich. Some great expertise, and I've learnt an enormous amount. Thanks for your time, everybody, and thanks, everybody, for dialing in.
Thank you.
And, just when you thought you had a good grasp of the issues, there's so much more to consider. So great discussion. Thank you. I just want to highlight for our clients, if you're a client of Icon or Workspace, you can access an app that we've created, the US Polls app. Type in US Poll, and it's a one-stop shop for all the news and insights around the elections. It offers Reuters news where writers report top election stories and react as they develop, genuine, unbiased financial insights, and fresh ideas in near real time. And we will be adding more information to the app over time. There you can get Reuters graphics. You can also access Refinitiv data stream in collaboration with Fathom Consulting to formulate macroeconomic analysis. So we invite everyone to access the app on Icon or Workspace. We will be having a workshop brought to you by Refinitiv Academy, where we have our customer success team who will help our clients, show them how to navigate the app and launch into specific workflow scenarios. You can ask questions, and we'll have some experts on. You can ask questions of our team of experts, and that is next week. Please fill out our survey before you leave today. We want to know what you think. We'd like to know what ideas that you have for future sessions, and be sure to join us and stay in touch. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.